Nicktoons Network NFL Rush Zone, Guardians of the Core. When I first saw the advertisement spots for this particular cartoon, I honestly thought it was a new cartoon. I had no idea that this was actually season 2. Believe it or not, those of you who only just recently discovered the show, just like I have. Apparently, the first season ended with an hour-long movie on February 5th, 2011. So, it's technically been close to an entire year since the show's first season ended. That's quite a big block of time for a cartoon to go, especially with no primetime spot reruns. So it's kind of interesting that Nicktoons Network is trying to pull out all the stops for this one. What I find especially interesting is that they're doing this at a time when most of their primetime spots are really taken up by what you could consider their quote-unquote original programming, with the exception of Dragon Ball GT reruns. So now we're going to have Monsuno, Planet Sheen, Wild Grinders, and this show. There's one thing I can honestly say. I don't really mind this one getting a mainstream spot as long as one particular thing happens. Cancel Wild Grinders, please. With all the other shows, those are just fine. But Wild Grinders, that show needs to die. And I'll discuss that more in detail in a different video, but this one's about NFL Rush Zone. Moving on from that long-winded intro, what I found interesting about this show, or actually I'm just going to start by giving a basic rundown of the premise for those of you who, like me, are probably going, what the hell is this show and how did it get on the air? The basic premise is, apparently there's this computer guy made of matrixy bits that recruits middle school age kids to be superheroes to protect the core. And apparently the core is a football-shaped device that has superpowers or something like that. And they're hidden in football stadiums all across the country. And it's up to these kids to protect football and the world from some weird bad guy who probably has the goal of taking over the world through the power of these magical footballs. Actually, despite some of my over-exaggeration there, I'm not quite sure what to say about the premise. It's original. You can't really go wrong with the classic good versus evil thing. It's just, as much as I'd like to say the premise is silly, with just the right person, you'd probably be able to make it work in a pretty interesting way. Heck, when it comes to sports being in cartoons, Kick Buttowski, a show that's all about a kid skateboarding and doing stunts, things I never would have expected to thoroughly enjoy in a cartoon. It takes the premise of sports and makes it entertaining and enjoyable for everybody. So, given the right frame of mind and a certain amount of creativity, this premise would have taken off like a rocket and made a pretty interesting show. But as it stands, the execution for this is pretty poor. I hate to say it, but it's pretty poor. Story writing-wise, it's just kind of average. Not good, but not necessarily bad either. I know I didn't really feel any connection with the characters or why I should care about the core or things like that, but maybe if I'd watched more than only half an hour of the hour-long premiere, I'd probably have a bigger... Actually, even if I had seen more than that, I highly doubt I'd feel any more invested than what I did. There's only one standout thing about the show that I can honestly say I liked and can really give it high praise for, and that would be the voice acting. Unlike other shows, Grumble Grumble Wild Grinders, the voice actors actually emoted. They actually had very distinctive, characterized voices, and the voices fit. It's just, I would have liked to see more animation in the characters' faces. That was one of the biggest pratfalls the show's animation. With the two-dimensional animation, there's barely any animation in the face. Barely anything to make it expressive. The mouth just kind of moves, maybe the eyebrows sort of go up, but the rest of the face just remains static. And that's kind of a shame. Speaking of the animation, it's a really weird conglomeration of 2D and 3D animation. The CGI actually reminded me heavily of Iron Man Armored Adventures. Is that where some of the animators went off to when Iron Man's put on hiatus? I'm seriously kind of wondering that, but that CGI did not gel very well with the two-dimensional world. In some cases, it was okay, but most of the time it just looked kind of awkward. And as I was watching, I couldn't help thinking, just stick with one or the other. Personally, I kind of would have preferred to see it fully CGI animated. Because even though I'm not really fond of Iron Man Armored Adventures CGI style of animation, at least the show would have had a consistent animation style and wouldn't have looked so bizarre. Now, an example of a show that does take different types of animation and mashes them together in an interesting and cohesive way, The Amazing World of Gumball. But in the case of that show, it's a stylistic choice, and it works really well most of the time. The biggest reason it works for The Amazing World of Gumball is because you know that the animators purposely chose to put all these different elements together as a stylistic and artistic choice. But in this case, in the case of NFL Guardians of the Rush Zone, sorry, I mispronounced the name. Well, in the case of this show, it just feels kind of sloppy. Again, those two different styles of animation just don't match very well. Another thing about the show, I found it kind of interesting that they decided to just have random live-action clips of football games. Why put live action in there? It felt like an unnecessary addition. I'm guessing these guys are working with a shoestring budget, but wouldn't it have made more sense to just animate scenes of the football players or something like that? I don't know. It just didn't fit. Again, it's like the same bizarre mix of the 2D and 3D animation. It was just kind of jarring to see some live action segments out of nowhere. And to bring up an example of a show that was able to implement live action segments, or just random live action clips, SpongeBob SquarePants. In the episode Band Geeks, why the live action clips work there is that it's an artistic or stylistic choice. It was put there to add extra depth or dimension. There was kind of a joke behind it. It fit for what the context and setup of the scene was. As for this show, it was really an unnecessary element. Because, quite frankly, the animation really did not complement the live action bits. If the characters would have looked a bit more realistic, if they would have been drawn in the style of King of the Hill or something like that, I could understand sneaking in some live action scenes, and I'd be a bit more willing to let it slide. But as it stands, again, another element that just didn't jive with what the show's animation is. As for the characters themselves, I honestly wouldn't be able to tell you what any of the characters did or what their characterization was, or even though I only watched 30 minutes, it felt like I was just watching static cardboard cutouts. It's horrible on my part to say that, and I'm wondering if I'd seen the entire special if I would have seen more depth and dimension to these characters, at least seeing some one or two dimensional development to them, but as it stands, the plot pretty much progressed as stuff happens, stuff happens, stuff happens, and the characters are just plot devices. I didn't really understand why I needed to care about them, or why I needed to feel invested, things like that. And story-wise, those of you that might be raising your eyebrows at why I'd want to feel invested in a show like this, think about your favorite cartoon for a second. Why you like the characters that you do. That is why you feel an urge to tune in every week and watch characters do things on a show most of the time, because you feel invested with the characters as well as the plot and the setup. I'll be frank about this. I'm kind of disappointed in this show. The premise does have potential. It's just not going to happen with the slipshod way it's set up right now. I will say it's better than Wild Grinders, but that's really not much of a compliment. It really isn't. Overall, I know most of this was mostly me griping about the animation styles, but it stood out like a sore thumb. It was hard not to. Any other element, I pretty much summed up what I had to say in that last part about characters and story. I didn't really feel invested in either, because I felt like I was watching cardboard cutouts tumbling around. Well, this is Eon, signing off. Bye.